Portcullis House, the Boothroyd Room. 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 Portcullis House, the Boothroyd Room.
Public come in. Just getting started now.
Okay. Order. Order. Mr. Gove, can I thank you very much indeed for giving evidence to us today. We've got 10 members at least who would like to put questions to you. We are aware of your time constraint, and that roughly works out, well, it works out exactly at 6 minutes each. So if you're still answering the question at that time, I may say, no disrespect, we need to move on to the next one. So if we can keep our questions brief, and if you could keep your answers as brief as possible, that would be really helpful, and I will write to you with follow-up questions afterwards, because there may be things that we wanted to be asked or arise from the evidence.
Of course. You might have to wait a moment. The stream hasn't started yet.
Well, when is the... Sorry, I'm sorry, technical... We're waiting to see whether the live streaming has started. The broadcasting of it.
There's no one at the end of the line. We're just going to check quickly, but we might have to wait until 11 o'clock. Is it okay? Okay.
I think we're going to crack on in view of the time.
As long as we've got it recorded, is that all right? Okay, perfect.
As long as we got it recorded, that's fine. Apologies for that.
No, not at all.
Interruption. Firstly, from me, how often do you intend to report orally to Parliament on the progress of the negotiations?
As often as Parliament feels it would be appropriate. So I'm delighted to either make statements, answer questions to this committee, or respond to urgent questions if Parliament feels that that's appropriate.
Right, but do you have a plan, given that there's a schedule of negotiating meetings which has been published?
Yes.
After, it's a 3-week cycle?
It's exactly that, a 3-week cycle.
So after every second one, is that something you'd be happy with? In terms of offering a statement to the House?
I would be delighted to be guided by this committee and others. I'm at Parliament's disposal.
Fine, that's really helpful. Now, it is reported that the government proposes to publish draft treaty text very soon. Can we just be sure that the moment it's offered to the EU negotiators, Parliament will see a copy?
I think it's fair to say that while we have and are preparing draft treaty text, the question of publication is one that has still not been decided on, both timing of publication and with whom it will be shared. But I very much take on board your point that at the point that it might be shared with the EU's negotiating team, that it may also therefore be shared with Parliament. But even if it is shared with the EU negotiating team, the EU negotiating team may not therefore be sharing it beyond simply their own Task Force UK team.
Now, my understanding was that the Commission had said that it wants to ensure full transparency and that anything they publish, they will share with European parliamentarians and, by definition, the rest of us. We couldn't end up in a situation where parliamentarians in the rest of the EU could see what the EU was proposing by way of text, but we couldn't see what the UK government was proposing. Well, that wouldn't be satisfactory, would it?
If the EU decide to publish a full text, then that is their decision. But it will be the case, of course, that they may share parts of their text, parts of the draft treaty with us, without fully publishing everything. So I think it's important to recognise that while we can have parts of the proposed treaty being shared during the course of the negotiations in a spirit of confidence and confidence building, either side, of course, may publish its treaty in full at an appropriate moment. But we reserve the right to decide when that publication should occur.
And you haven't taken a decision about when it would be appropriate to share it with Parliament?
Well, I think it would be appropriate when it's published to be shared with Parliament and others, but the key question as to when it is published, no decision has yet been taken on that timing.
Right. Now, the government produced a 60-page impact assessment for the proposed free trade agreement with the United States of America. Are you planning to do the same for your proposed free trade agreement with the EU?
No.
Why not?
Because we are going to take a different approach. We're going to invite from across our range of organisations their views on what the impact of a free trade agreement with the EU and consequent changes might be. I am personally sceptical of efforts to say that any given impact assessment by a government department is an accurate prediction of the future. I think that as load-bearing devices go, they are not perhaps the most effective ways of delivering a proper range of views about what the economic consequences of a course of action might be.
So if that's the case, why did the government publish 60 pages of economic assessment of the free trade agreement with the United States of America if you're not persuaded of the benefit of such an assessment?
It is an evolving picture, and I am certainly...
I think it's called a contradiction.
No, I don't think it is. I think it is an evolving picture, and I'm not persuaded of the merits of publishing assessments and then assuming that those are going to give us an accurate prediction of the future.
So when your colleagues extol the virtues of a free trade agreement with the United States of America, praying in aid the economic assessment that's just been published, you're not persuaded that that is correct?
No, I think that's not what I said. I think that it's important to recognise that there are always going to be a range of views about what a particular course of economic action would lead to. But I think it's important not to look at any particular course of economic action in isolation.
Fine. And then just finally from me, just to clarify on goods moving from GB to Northern Ireland under the Northern Irish Protocol.
Yes.
We know there are some regulatory checks at the moment. We discovered that in the last 3 years. There will be additional checks once the Northern Ireland Protocol is implemented, won't there be?
That'll be a matter for the Joint Committee.
But is there any doubt about that?
I don't want to prejudice what happens in the Joint Committee.
But how will you ensure that goods that are at risk of entering the Republic of Ireland are properly identified if then you can't say at the moment there will be some additional checks?
That's a matter for the Joint Committee.
Right, okay. All right. Mark Eastwood.
Mr. Gove, the Chairman's already touched upon the US trade deal. President Trump has committed to a US-UK trade deal already. What are the chances of both the US and EU trade deals being completed by the end of the year?
There's no reason why they can't both be completed by the end of the year.
Yeah. So, bearing in mind the looming presidential election and narrowing window of opportunity, would you consider giving equal status to both trade negotiations?
We do give equal status to both trade negotiations. I had the opportunity to meet Bob Lighthizer, the US Trade Representative, and I know that my counterpart Liz Truss did when he was here recently. And we're doing everything we can, not just to pursue a trade relationship and a new trade agreement with the United States, but also with Australia and New Zealand, and indeed as part of the CPTPP process as well.
Okay, fine. Moving on from that, obviously the big issue at the moment is the coronavirus. Given the spread of coronavirus across Europe, Italy's recent lockdown, and the prospect of coronavirus lingering for months to come, do you anticipate difficulties in arranging face-to-face meetings and a general slowing down on the negotiations with the EU?
It's a live question. We were looking forward to the Joint Committee meeting in the UK on the 30th of this month, and we were also looking forward, obviously, to the next stage of the negotiations going ahead. But we've had indications today from Belgium that there may be specific public health concerns, so I'll keep the House and the Committee updated on progress.
Okay. Because, I mean, we've already seen huge turbulence in the markets resulting from coronavirus.
Yes.
What impact, if any, will coronavirus on the deadline, and could there be a possible extension to that deadline?
No, there won't be any extension to the deadline.
Okay. Considering recent scenes of panic buying, going back onto the coronavirus, with supermarkets struggling to restock things like toilet roll, hand sanitisers, quick enough. Are there any lessons we can learn from this experience when it comes to preparedness and supply chains?
Well, I would draw a distinction between the two. I think one thing is I was very reassured to see on the BBC News website earlier today that one of our own strong domestic suppliers of loo roll in Essex had managed to scale up to meet the need, which is an example, once again, of a business's ingenuity and capacity to adapt. More broadly, I think the work that was done by the Civil Contingency Secretariat last year in order to prepare for what the consequences of a potential no-deal exit might have been was an example of limbering up. It was an example of government anticipating, as our brilliant civil servants do, a range of potential outcomes. The Civil Contingency Secretariat, along with the Department of Health and Social Care, are doing a great job in preparing for the impact of coronavirus now. But I think it's also the case that business is looking separately, entirely separately, at some of the changes that will come about and which are relatively predictable at the end of this year and thinking about how they can take advantage of those new opportunities and also mitigate any risks.
Okay, thank you. In terms of, moving on from coronavirus, in terms of defence, as far as EU defence cooperation is concerned, how would you ensure that the future agreement does not tie us up in the EU regulations and rules?
We've been perfectly clear that we want to have a strong relationship with the EU on defence, but we will not do anything which would prejudice our autonomy, freedom of action, and indeed our freedom to procure what we need to procure in our own way. So the Prime Minister has been very, very clear about that. And it is the case that you can have structured cooperation, so that, for example, we can make sure that our units which are forward deployed in places like Estonia can move smoothly through Europe in order to perform and discharge their functions. And of course, more recently, we've been cooperating in the Sahel with the French on a bilateral basis, but the one thing that we will not do is to be tied up in any common security or defence policy.
Okay, thank you for that. In terms of the framework, so the freedom that comes from taking back control of our regulatory framework means that we're able to align on some things and diverge on others.
Yes.
What areas specifically do you see as aligning, and which do you think we will diverge on?
I think it's ultimately it will be for this Parliament and future Parliaments to decide, and this Parliament and future Parliaments will be influenced by business and changing economic circumstances. But as a number of people said, there's no point in diverging for the sake of divergence. But when we think about alignment, I think it's also important to underline that we will not be dynamically aligning with the EU. We will not be aligning in a way which means that we will be following ECJ jurisprudence or subject to any European agency. But of course, it may well be the case that individual businesses, observing what the rules are to sell into the EU market quite properly, produce and manufacture goods which can sell easily into that market.
Okay, thank you. On top of the measures already in place to help business, what additional help can we give to businesses to prepare for exit with or without a deal?
Well, I think we are seeking to communicate to business at the moment the fact that whether it's a Canada-style or an Australia-style relationship with the EU, there are some changes that business will need to make. So we know that there are around 140,000 businesses that export to the EU but not beyond it. Those are businesses which HMRC has been in touch with already, and we're continuing our engagement with those businesses in order to explain how new customs procedures will have to become part of their way of trading with the EU. But it's also the case that the Department for International Trade is also engaging with those businesses to say that preparing for those new processes is not just a way of ensuring continuity of business with the EU, it's also a way of scaling up to take advantage of other trading opportunities with other countries as well.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about this question of proximity. So your party, Mr. Gove, fought the general election on the basis of an oven-ready deal.
Yes.
And that oven-ready deal was as set out in the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. But on the 27th of February, you came to the House and argued that proximity is not a determining factor in FTAs with neighbouring states. And yet, paragraph 77 of the political declaration states that given the Union and the United Kingdom's geographic proximity and economic interdependence, the future relationship must ensure open and fair competition encompassing robust commitment to ensure a level playing field. So can you explain the disparity between those two positions? On the one hand, signing up to a political declaration which puts proximity as the defining factor in the relationship, and then everything that's happened since the general election seems to be the government walking away from that commitment.
I don't think we've been walking away from the political declaration at all. The point about the political declaration is that it envisages a zero tariff, zero quota free trade agreement at the end of this process. What we've been seeking to do is to build on existing precedents that the EU acknowledges and understands, and saying that we want to have a relationship entirely similar to that which the EU has with other sovereign equals. And of course, it's a geographical fact that the UK is proximate, but that does not mean and need not mean that we accept EU institutions exercising a supervisory role in Great Britain. And that's the distinction that we were seeking to draw.
But why then did you sign up in the political declaration to robust commitments to ensuring a level playing field because of proximity. I mean, that is fundamental to the whole argument about a level playing field and the need to have alignment in order to get zero tariffs and zero quotas.
Again, I think there are two things. The volume of trade that the UK does with the EU is broadly similar to the volume of trade that the US does with the EU, and yet the EU were perfectly prepared during the TTIP negotiations to offer a zero tariff arrangement to the US, even though, of course, there was no geographical proximity there. So, you know, we take the view that we can look at the totality of commitments which the EU has entered into, and when it comes to issues of workers' rights, social protection, and the environment, which are often the issues which people refer to when they use the phrase level playing field, the Prime Minister has been clear, and I've been clear, that not only will we not row back on protections in any of those areas, we hope, and we already, I believe, are setting the pace when it comes to areas of environmental protection, and therefore the EU can feel reassured, if it is concerned about these areas, that there won't be any attempt on our part to erode environmental protections in a way that they might consider would give us a temporary competitive advantage.
But the premise was that we'll get zero tariff and zero quota deal, and yet the political declaration is saying that without those level playing fields, particularly around state aid and competition, we won't get it. I mean, do you not think it's a problem that this was sold in the general election as oven ready, but in fact it was at the back of the frozen food section?
No, I think it is the case that you can often have frozen foods which are indeed oven ready. They just take slightly longer for the microwave to ping. But the critical point, I think, is that the political declaration makes the point that both sides want to achieve that zero tariff, zero quota deal, but also more broadly, one of the reasons why it should be possible with goodwill to conclude a deal is that the deal that we're putting forward, and this relates to the point that the Chairman made about publishing texts, the deal that we want to put forward is one that is built on precedents. So we want to say, in this respect, it's similar or completely analogous to the relationship that you have concluded with Canada or with Japan or with South Korea. So therefore, in that sense, rather than having to extend the metaphor, rather than having to assemble all the ingredients from scratch and try to cook all together, it's an already prepared set of dishes, rather like the Marks and Spencer's deal you get, where you get a starter, a main course, and a pudding, and then you can decide which of the three you want to get, but all for £9.99, and then you're away.
Sounds absolutely delicious, Mr. Gove. The thing I wanted to move on to was the Northern Ireland Protocol, and particularly the issue of state aid. So, as you'll know, under the Northern Ireland Protocol, the UK is, or Northern Ireland, I should say, is signed up to the full panoply of state aid laws and rules and regulations. So can you explain how that's going to impact on businesses that are, for example, trading out of England into Northern Ireland and then on to the European Union? All of those businesses are going to be subject to the full panoply of state aid regulations. Is that correct?
No, I don't believe so. And I think that the subsidy regime that the UK proposes to put in place after we've left the EU will be one that I think that the EU will recognise as a robust system. More than that, I think it's also important, as I mentioned briefly earlier to the chair, that the effective working of the protocol is a matter for the joint committee to resolve, and I'm looking forward to that meeting in order to ensure that we can develop the protocol, implement it in all its provisions in a way that ensures that the people of Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland economy benefit.
So George Pell, I'm sorry, am I out of time?
No, apologies.
Sorry.
Just to get everybody in, I'm going to have to move on. Sally Ann Hart.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Gove. I'm from a coastal rural community whose fishing and agriculture sectors are vitally important. When looking at the negotiation, do you think fishing and agriculture are strong leverage for the negotiation? If not, what is strengthening it, our position, and what is weakening it?
I think that we're in a strong position in both those areas. I think, in fact, I know that there are DEFRA officials and others who form part of the negotiating team But I think there are two things in particular that I would mention. The first is, as all members of this committee know, in the United Kingdom's exclusive economic zone, we have the majority of a fishing resource that is, or has been, I should say, in the past, within the EU. This is a great sovereign asset, and other countries have been clear that they wish to retain access to it. Well, their access will only be on our terms. We'll be an independent coastal state, and that is a strong position for the United Kingdom to be in. And then on agriculture and agri-food overall, I'd say several things. The first is, of course, that we import more from the EU than we export to the EU, so there is an interest in particular sectors in the EU in maintaining access to our markets. Obviously, there are some sectors in the UK, particularly the sheep meat sector, that currently rely heavily on the EU, but there are other opportunities for that sector to diversify as well. But also outside the EU, we can develop a bespoke system of agricultural support which will enable our farmers to be paid for the environmental benefits that they provide, as well as making a success of marketing British food.
Thank you. Just picking up on the sovereign asset point, bearing in mind that we want the future negotiation and our relationship with the EU to be based on mutual recognition of sovereignty, equal sovereign nations, having just restored ours nearly. How do you respond to Michael Barnier's rejection of the UK's position on fisheries after the first negotiating round? Mr Barnier noted that asking to negotiate access to stocks annually was impractical given the number of stocks involved, and also given the need for the fishing industry to have some sort of certainty in order to plan.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that there are some on the EU side who said to the UK, when you're out of the EU, you can't have the same rights that you had when you were in the EU. And the same thing applies to other countries' access to our fishing waters. They cannot simultaneously say that now that we're out of the EU, there are certain rights of access that we lose to their market. And they must maintain exactly the same rights of access to our fishing waters. The approach we propose to take is going to change. We've made it clear that we're going to move away from what's called relative stability towards something like zonal attachment, and that means that we will be managing our stocks in the interests of conservation more effectively than has been the case in the CFP, and also for our coastal communities. Michel Barnier is a tough negotiator, but it is the case that this is a sovereign UK resource, and we will decide access to it on our terms.
Thank you. The UK said it will assess the progress of talks in June and decide if it wishes to continue negotiating. Would you walk away from the talks over fisheries? And if yes, what would constitute acceptable progress by June? And what will the government have to support the UK fishing and seafood industries if the talks were to break down, and what plans would have to be put in place, if any, to protect our fisheries?
Both sides will take stock in June. I'm confident that we will be making progress in all sorts of areas, but there may be, during the course of the negotiations, there may be bumps in the road, but I'm confident that we will be making progress overall. It is the case that we have plans to support the fishing sector in lots of ways, including by getting a replacement for the EMFF, the fund that helps ports and harbours to scale up in order to deal, as they will be, with the additional resources that are being landed. But I'm confident that we will make progress there, and I'm also confident that this coming December we will be negotiating, as an independent coastal state, what the access of European nations will be, as we will be every December, in the way that countries like Norway do.
So just taking up on other agreements with the negotiating point, do you expect negotiations on further agreements or other agreements to continue past the 31st of December 2020?
I'd like as much progress as possible to be made. I hope that we can secure a free trade agreement. I'm certain that we can secure agreements on fisheries. I think that when it comes to other areas like internal security, I'm very confident that progress can be made, but a lot depends on goodwill on the EU side in those areas.
Thank you. I've finished my questions.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. Anthony Higginbotham.
Thank you, Mr. Gove. I just want to return to the political declaration, if I may, because during the last stage of the negotiations, that felt almost a bit like a side issue. It wasn't the thrust of the negotiations, but the European Union and others are now holding it up as almost a panacea. You know, this is the authoritative text. But being a political declaration, it is inherently political. From your conversations with the European Union, do you get the sense that they recognise the political situation in the UK has changed, and so the end result may also change?
Well, I think that's a very good point. I think that in some conversations with people in European nations, the point is sometimes made, well, your Prime Minister now has a healthy majority. Now that he has a healthy majority, he can operate in a different way to his predecessor. So if he wanted to get the right deal, he could extend, couldn't he? But the point that we have consistently made is the reason the Prime Minister has this big majority is because he made it clear during the general election that he would not extend, that he wanted a relationship where we were outside the single market and outside the customs union and a relationship of sovereign equals. To their credit, Michel Barnier and Ursula von der Leyen and others have not just recognised that, but articulated that. But not every European politician fully appreciates the point that you make about the political context in which we're now operating.
Which brings on to a broader point. To what extent, I mean, in the last set of negotiations as well, the European Commission very much took the lead and the nations took a step back. Given what you've just said about the Commission broadly recognising the political situation in the individual member states, in some cases being less so, is that negotiation likely to be the same? It is very much UK to Commission,
yes.
Or will there be a greater role for the member states?
It will be UK to Commission, but to take 2 points. One is that the Joint Committee, which is there to supervise the implementation of the withdrawal agreement on the Northern Ireland Protocol, member states have a right to send their representatives alongside. So Commissioner Šefčovič is the EU representative, Michel Barnier is his alternate, but other member states may well make requests. But certainly when it comes to negotiating the FTA, it is the case that the negotiations are undertaken by the Commission on behalf of the whole, and in the past member states have sometimes been frustrated that not all of their asks have been reflected in the negotiations. The point has been made by Peter Mandelson that when he was Trade Commissioner, sometimes he had to disappoint the French and others because he was thinking about the common good of the whole EU in those negotiations. So it will be the Commission's representatives negotiating on behalf of the whole EU, but we have good bilateral relationships with all of the EU member states, and of course they feed into the process of making sure that the Commission's mandate is respected.
Yeah, but you are confident, the government is confident that the Commission recognises
yes.
the political dynamic that now exists in the UK?
Yes.
Thank you, that's very helpful. On the June deadline, the government's been very clear, you've been very clear, that will be a stock take. There is no intention to extend at the end of the year. I think that's the right thing. What is the test that's going to be set at that June meeting that will decide whether we decide that sufficient progress is made? And is that the same test that the European Union will have to say whether they think sufficient progress?
I can't speak for the EU. They've talked about various different ways in which they will judge good faith. Again, I wouldn't want to prejudice the decision that will be taken in June by saying that there are certain issues that must be resolved in a particular way in order for us to send that signal. We'll know it when we see it, but one would hope that progress, for example, in granting equivalence on financial services and on data, those sorts of things which the EU should be making progress on. They're for instances, but I wouldn't want to at this stage say anything hard and fast, because it may be that we're making very good progress in other areas, but one or two things which we'd hoped we'd make progress on may not necessarily be as advanced as we'd want, and it's one of those things where you just have to look at the overall package and consider the dynamic in the talks.
Yeah, so it's a dynamic package. Essentially, there will be bumps in the road.
Yes.
But in June, it is a stock take of the whole thing.
Exactly.
Rather than
exactly.
Which leads me quite nicely on to my final question, which is on this, the UK government's position being that this will be a free trade agreement and only a free trade agreement. The EU's position being that this should be comprehensive and include everything on top of. Are there any areas within that you can see a particular friction where we've looked at it and gone, actually, we can't do this institution to institution or structured cooperation, and we may need some more formal agreement. And if there are any of those examples, will they also be negotiated by the end of the year?
I think that we're thinking about a free trade agreement, fisheries agreement, an agreement ideally on internal security. As I indicated to Sally Ann, I think on internal security, that we may not necessarily have concluded everything by the 31st.
And will there be a way to essentially continue some of that cooperation
Oh, yes.
in the interim?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, yes.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Chair. As most fishing quota is owned by just a handful of companies, small inshore fishers actually don't really gain anything from leaving the CFP, but yet they will actually face increased bureaucracy, tariffs, just exactly like Norway, and also possibly shipping delays, which could increase their costs and decrease their value. So what support is the government going to give to the inshore small boat fishing industry?
Well, the DEFRA Secretary of State has been clear that additional quota that we can secure as a result of taking back control of that sovereign resource will be allocated more to smaller boats.
But only on a very fractional basis. I mean, there's still a plan that actually additional quota will follow previous quota and still end up largely in the hands of the handful of big companies across the UK.
Well, there is precedent for the reallocation of existing quota. Richard Benyon, when he was Fisheries Minister, was able to make some significant advance there. But it will be the case that essentially the more access to the more resource we have, the more quota will go to smaller boats and to precisely the sorts of communities which you are understandably concerned to see prosper and benefit.
Indeed I am, because it's in my constituency, but the UK has always had the power to reform quota. So why did the government never in the past look at reforming quota and allocating it to areas? On the west coast where I am, a lot of the quota ended up bought up by the northeast of Scotland, and all of our fishing industry is basically shellfish.
Well, I'd say two things. The first thing there is that Richard Benyon, I mentioned earlier, did establish that you can reallocate quota, and quota has been reallocated in certain circumstances. And there is more that we can do. You're absolutely right. But I wouldn't want for a moment to take away from the success of the fisheries sector in the northeast, and also the additional potential for growth that exists as a result of our departure. And the Scottish Government's produced helpful economic modelling. I mentioned to the Chairman earlier that not all economic modelling necessarily is an accurate predictor of what will happen in the future, but the Scottish Government have indicated that there will be additional jobs and income as a result of leaving the CFP.
I don't begrudge any success to the northeast, but you must recognise that on the west coast and the islands, it's the small boat industry that is utterly critical to coastal communities. Now, in my constituency, in Ayrshire, looking across at Northern Ireland, we already have boats that are talking about registering in Northern Ireland so they can land there straight into the single market. Does he recognise what that would do to the onshore industry of harbours, markets and processing?
Yes, I do appreciate that, but I'm sure that we'll be able, through the working of the Joint Committee and through the eventual arrangements that we reach with the EU, I'm sure that we won't be in a position where fishermen on the west coast have to contemplate landing their catch anywhere other than where they land it at the moment.
But obviously the Joint Committee will only be looking at Northern Ireland, so is he proposing that they may forbid fishermen from elsewhere to re-register their boats?
No, but I think that I hope that at the conclusion of the talks that there'll be no reason for people to contemplate making that change.
In the future relationship paper, it talks about recognising the interests of the devolved governments in agriculture and fishing, and particularly in fishing, commits to work with them. Exactly how will that happen? Because up till now, the devolved governments have felt they've been able to turn up here and be talked at, but that they've not particularly been listened to. So what will be different now around fishing?
Well, before I did this job, I was DEFRA Secretary, and we had, and I inherited a practice whereby most months the relevant ministers from the UK, Wales and Scotland, and now of course the Northern Ireland Executive has been restored, Northern Ireland ministers as well, would meet to discuss issues of common interest, particularly with respect to the EU negotiations. And there were a number of very useful practical suggestions that were made at different points by Fergus Ewing and Leslie Griffiths and others. One particular point that Fergus made was about the importance of seeing if we could prioritise fresh fish and shellfish in certain circumstances. And we have explored that. George Eustace, when he was Minister of State, did some work on that. It may be in the future that we need to do that. It's also the case that, partly as a result of the input from the Scottish Government, that in our talks with the EU and the points that we were making, a recognition was made by the French that they should have a border inspection post for fish at Boulogne at the fish market rather than at Calais. So that's just one area. More broadly, Mike Russell, on behalf of the Scottish Government, has made a number of suggestions about how we can involve the devolved administrations in negotiations, which have informed our approach. Now, you'll appreciate Mike is a very robust guy, and there are aspects of what we're doing with which he profoundly disagrees, but nevertheless, it's the case that he lands arguments well, and those arguments do weigh with us.
And do you recognise that among the industries themselves, among the NFU in Scotland and also the fishing representatives, there's great concern about the idea of the overarching frameworks being decided at Westminster for an industry in Scotland that is so different and yet represents the majority of fishing in the UK?
I think that it's important that we do have common frameworks in order to ensure that the UK's internal market works well, and that we don't, for example, have different animal health rules in Scotland from England. But it is also the case that fisheries protection, for example, the Scottish Government is in charge of. The subsidy or support regime for agriculture, the Scottish Government is in charge of. So I think devolution works, but we always keep, as a UK government, the situation, our relationship with the devolved administrations in a way which allows us, if it is the case that the Scottish or the Welsh or the Northern Ireland Executive feel that the shoe is pinching too tightly in any particular area, we're always open to trying to do what we can to make it work.
Can I ask you, Minister?
Sorry, we're going to have to move on. Right, Peter Bone.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr Gove, take you back to the referendum. You, part of Vote Leave, along with the current Prime Minister, did a wonderful job of the virtues of coming out of the EU. I wasn't part of Vote Leave. I had grassroots out, and with the Honourable Member for Corby, we toured the country. But in the evening, there you were on the television screen, banging the drum for Brexit, and you succeeded. We then had the surprise resignation of David Cameron, because he said he wouldn't do it, but he did. Then we had a bit of a messy leadership election for our new Prime Minister, but the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead became Prime Minister. She said Brexit meant Brexit, and we were all happy. Brexiteers, great speeches. People came here, sat at that where you are, sir, told the Brexit Committee wonderful things. Secretary of State for Brexiting the EU, the Right Honourable Member for Holton, Price and Howden, told us lots of things, just as you were doing there. And we were all happy. And people went to Downing Street, we were all engaged, and it was great. And then Chequers came along. Current Prime Minister resigned, Secretary of State for Brexit, European Union resigned, and there had been a secret policy developed in the Cabinet Office, completely undermining what everyone thought was going to happen, everything we'd been told. Now, why should I now believe anything you're saying today when that happened in the past? Now, I'm not suggesting for one moment that the Prime Minister is planning that, but Brexiteers must be concerned that we've been bitten once, we shouldn't be bitten twice. What can you say to put confidence in people like myself that we are going to deliver what we say we're going to deliver?
Well, I'd refer you to, and I know that they are speeches, but I'd refer you to the two speeches that the Prime Minister gave and that David Frost gave. The Prime Minister at the Painted Hall in Greenwich, David Frost in Brussels, which lay out very clearly the approach that the government is taking. And then I'd also refer you to some of the criticisms that have been directed at the government when the government's made clear that we won't be part of certain EU institutions. Now, you can say, well, I'm not convinced yet. It will be the patient work of the government over the course of the next few months to seek to reassure you and others that we're putting our words into action. But I think the conclusion that most people would draw is that the Prime Minister is someone who is determined to keep his promises, and we as a Cabinet are determined to support him in making sure that we leave in a way that everyone recognises places us outside the single market and the customs union.
But Mr Gove, you were a very staunch supporter of the former Prime Minister and her agreement. You said to me in this committee room last year, after the current Prime Minister was in power, that you would still vote for what we call Mrs May's deal if it came back to the House of Commons. If we get to a stage where the EU isn't agreeing to a proper free trade agreement, how can I and others be assured that you would actually walk away with what's called in the past a no deal, rather than actually just get a deal done on any basis?
Well, I think there are two things to say. I was one of the people who believed that we should leave at the earliest opportunity, but I also recognised, and I think I mentioned to this committee, that the deal that the Prime Minister, I can't remember if it was just before or after, was on the verge of securing or had secured was better than the one that Theresa had secured, and I emphatically think that. During the course of the referendum and subsequently, as I say, I've argued that we should be outside the single market and outside the customs union, but I was prepared during the last Parliament, because of the arithmetic, to contemplate compromise in order to make sure that we actually left, but I understand that people can differ on what the right approach to that deal was. But now we are in the position of having left. The question now is whether or not we have an Australia-style or a Canada-style relationship with the EU, and that will depend on what the EU's response is. But we've left. The Prime Minister has been very clear that we're not going to extend the transition period. David Frost made the point that on the 1st of January 2021, when the transition period ends, we will have full economic and political sovereignty, and why should we wish to surrender that? And the course is set. I think that it would be foolish for anyone to imagine that the Prime Minister is not going to stick to that timetable and stick to that commitment. I think that people underestimate him at their peril.
I'm very reassured. Thank you, sir.
Good. Right. Jane Stevenson.
Thank you. During our current negotiations with the EU, can you see any areas where what we might be being attempted to be agreed could negatively affect our flexibility or our ability to strike trade deals with other countries in other future negotiations?
The Prime Minister has been very clear that that should not happen.
Okay, and our US and UK teams are liaising over potential areas where that could be a problem?
Absolutely. I think it will be the case that there will be some sovereign decisions that the UK takes, for example, on animal welfare, which the EU would think, oh, well, that's reassuring, that makes it easier for us, and where some in America might say, that might create an issue. But we would be making that decision as a sovereign country. We'd be making it because we believed it was right for Britain, not because we were trying to cozy up to one side or the other. It's certainly the case that the US trade representative team understand that. They know that there are certain things which might smooth and certain things which might slow the conclusion of a free trade agreement, but they understand that we are making these decisions as a sovereign country in our own interests, not because we're trying to butter up anyone else.
Thank you. On oven-ready deals, and I'd just like to say that just because something's in the freezer doesn't mean it isn't oven-ready, because they can go straight through. I'm thinking of the Commonwealth. We saw our Commonwealth Day this week. Which Commonwealth countries do we potentially have oven-ready deals?
I think it is the case that with both Australia and New Zealand, there is an eagerness on the part of both of those countries to conclude trade agreements. Also, I had the opportunity to meet recently Catherine McKenna, who is the infrastructure minister in the Canadian government and who was herself a trade lawyer. And naturally, I think that Canada may take a little bit longer than Australia and New Zealand, but it's emphatically the case that there's enthusiasm there. But it's also the case that there are opportunities that we have to conclude trade agreements with less developed nations as well, which we hope will be in both our interests.
Do you see the Commonwealth having a special status in our future, or will it be treated the same as other countries?
I think well, there are other countries with which I'm sure we can have very fruitful trading relationships, Japan, South Korea and others, which are not Commonwealth nations. So I don't think that Commonwealth membership per se means that any country is more or less likely to have a good trading relationship and a good FTA with the UK. But there are, of course, other ties that we have with Commonwealth nations, which this committee will be aware of, the Five Eyes security relationship and other relationships. And the Commonwealth is a very, very precious thing.
Thank you. And on coronavirus, obviously there are practical issues that are going to come. Do you think the economic effect over the next year or so, will that focus people's minds to wanting stability more and change the negotiations?
I think we're still in relatively early days in assessing what the economic impact of the coronavirus will be. And I know that it will be the subject of debate and discussion following on from the Chancellor's budget. I think at this stage, one of the things that the coronavirus reminds us of is the importance of making sure that we have resilient economies, and that those resilient economies make sure that productivity growth is spread more equally. And again, I think one of the other themes of the Chancellor's budget, which I think is right, is making sure that the fact that our country has had productivity and growth concentrated in London and the South East in recent decades is something that needs to be addressed. And one of the things that we need to do is to make sure that the infrastructure is in place, and also the commitment to spreading educational excellence is in place in order to make sure that we can prosper. And I think that coronavirus only reinforces those lessons.
Thank you. And finally, does the government intend to opt into any EU programmes after?
Yes, but we've been clear that we won't opt into programmes that require us to submit to ECJ jurisdiction, but it is the case that we want to be part of a number of science programmes, and it is also the case that we're open to participation in Erasmus as well. But of course we need to make sure that we're getting value for money. One of the criticisms that's been mounted at Erasmus is that many of those who've benefited from it have tended to come from higher socioeconomic brackets. And one of the things, again, that we want to make sure is that every penny that we spend on education, we spend helping children from every background, particularly the most disadvantaged. But it's certainly the case that on current trajectories, if we can carry on being part of Erasmus, we do see benefits in that.
Thank you very much. Rupa Huck.
Yeah, I wanted to press you a bit more on some of these international cooperation arrangements on the other side, and also to wish you Happy Science Week, and wish everyone Happy Science Week. So a year ago, we had the European Medicines Agency in London, hundreds of super qualified scientists working here. We've lost that to Amsterdam. And everyone keeps talking about coronavirus. Is it true that the government's red lines are going to preclude it from being in the early warning system? Because surely, with a global pandemic like that, it makes sense to share information with our nearest neighbours. But I've heard this rumour that these dogmatic red lines are precluding us from this. Is this right, or am I missing?
Well, we want to share information with every nation, and it's in the nature of the collaboration when you deal with a virus like this that it transcends not just national but also continental boundaries. So the work that was undertaken, for example, to look at how we could deal with SARS was work that was conducted on a global scale, and scientific cooperation is conducted on a global scale as well.
So the early warning system, is there scope for us remaining part of that?
We will always put the health and the security of the British people first, and we will look at every instrument on the basis of what it provides for us.
Okay, the REACH chemicals regulator?
Well, one of the problems with REACH is that it involves ECJ jurisdiction.
I mean, is this just a self-imposed red line for the sake of it, though? I mean,
no, it's recognising that we have voted to be a sovereign nation, and part of being a sovereign nation means that we cannot have courts and institutions which are not accountable to the British people imposing on the British people laws for which they did not vote, policed in a way to which they do not consent.
So yesterday we had a first rebellion with the oven-baked new big majority government over national security over Huawei. The European arrest warrant, surely with terrorism as an everyday thing we see on the monitor every day, threat level is severe, it would make sense to remain in cooperative arrangements and databases with our nearest neighbours for criminals and terrorists, all these sort of things.
Well, there are a range of tools to which states have access in order to make sure that they keep their people safe, and we need to look at them on a case-by-case basis. One of the challenges with the European arrest warrant is that, again, it may rely on our participation in institutions which would, in some respects, undermine our sovereignty, and there are real strengths in our ability to fight terrorism by being outside the EU and having more effective border controls.
I mean, Europol, again, Nigel Mills and I are both co-chairs of the APPG on anti-corruption. Money laundering goes across borders. Does it not make sense to remain in Europol? Is that an agency that we could opt into after the transition period?
We will look at each of the arrangements that we have on a case-by-case basis, but it's not the case that you necessarily need to, as I mentioned earlier, submit to EU jurisprudence in order to effectively fight crime.
So from all these answers, including your dislike of impact assessments, does that mean that now sovereignty is being prioritised over everything, really, over medicine, over the economy? Is that the new overriding aim?
No.
It certainly feels like it. And also, when I asked in the chamber about the equality impact assessment, about all this, where's that? I don't see that anywhere. Is that another type of impact assessment you're not keen on?
No, I mean, obviously there's a statutory obligation for legislation to have equality impact assessments following on from the Equality Act. My scepticism towards economic impact assessments is that people assume that they are predictions when they're simply forecasts, and forecasts need to be seen in the round. There is sometimes a tendency for people to assume that an economic forecast is a determinative prediction, as though it had the same degree of force, given that this is National Science Week, of a law of physics. Manifestly, it does not.
And again, sort of part of the argument for leaving, and I know your speech, the facts of life say why Britain and Europe would be better off after. It was always about vast sums of money. What do you make of the assessment that it's going to have cost 200 billion by the end of this year, which is almost equivalent to what we were paying him for 47 years? Is that money well spent, or is it okay because of sovereignty being regained?
No, I think I don't recognise and would contest that figure. It is the case that our departure from the European Union means that the large sums of money which were automatically debited from the UK bank account to go to the EU, we now get back. But it's also the case that there are economic and other opportunities for our country to become more prosperous outside.
And the 50,000 new customs officers, how far are we with recruiting those, and what will the cost of those be?
Well, it is the case that rather than customs officers, there will be people who work in as customs agents, freight forwarders and others who will see new economic opportunities. But of course, it is the case that while government is supporting the expansion of work in that area, the private sector will be in the lead in assessing the degree of engagement that it needs with, as I say, new customs agents and existing freight forwarders.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to move on. Nigel Mills.
Mr. Gove, please give me a rough percentage of your confidence of getting a deal. Are you 100% confident you'll get a trade deal by the end of the year? Is it a bit less than that?
Odds on.
Odds on would be 51%, wouldn't it?
It would be anything from 51 to 99.
And are you more confident at the end of the first 3-week phase than you were at the start of it?
Yes, and more particularly so is David Frost, our negotiator. The areas where there might be difficulties were well advertised beforehand, but David and the negotiating team reported a good and positive dynamic, and I also felt that the comments that Michel Barnier made after, while of course, as Sally-Anne pointed out, he repeated some of the, particular areas of contention, it was also the case that the tone that he used in public reflected the cordiality in private.
And while we're on the subject of Mr. Frost, presumably you'd have no objection to him giving us evidence, given he's making public speeches about EU policy?
There are appropriate rules that govern the position of special advisors, but of course, if you wanted to ask David or any member of the negotiating team to give evidence, I would of course pass that invitation on.
It's interesting because those rules about special advisors generally involve them not making public pronouncements on matters of policy. and them not giving instructions to civil servants. I mean, do you report to Mr Frost, or does he report to you, or do you both report to the Prime Minister? I mean, I'm kind of a bit unsure how the structure of this works.
We both report to the Prime Minister.
Who reports to Mr Cummins?
Okay. I think earlier on when we were talking about internal security, you said you weren't entirely confident of having that deal done by the 31st. Was my hearing right at that point?
Well, I think that there are particular challenges there. I hope that we will. But one of the things that I just your question gives you an opportunity to flag up is that if we're going to have access to, for example, the Schengen Information System 2, then the question is to what extent does the EU insist on, and we've touched on this before, ECJ jurisprudence governing access to it and its use, and that may be a particularly tough sticking point. But I'm convinced that, given that the EU benefits just as much, if not more, from our cooperation in some of these security and law enforcement tools, that we should be able to find a way forward.
So what are you envisaging some kind of implementation period or transition phase at the end of the year before that new security arrangement's in place, or would we just drop out of everything and then recreate the new ones at some later point?
There are all. If we were not in, if we did not have access to the Schengen Information System 2 database, there are many other things that we can do and use in order to protect and enhance national security. And if it's the case that a new tool or access to an existing tool on new terms arises, then we can take advantage of that. But I think it's important to bear in mind that many of these tools were not in place 10 years ago, or rather the UK did not have access to them 10 years ago. And I don't think anyone would say that the government of Gordon Brown, in which your chairman served with such distinction, was presiding over an unsafe UK.
So just to be clear, at the end of the year, in all aspects, we will move to the new relationship as agreed.
Yes.
Or we will leave everything, and you're not looking at any transitions or temporary carry-ons.
No.
And in terms of the trade deal, there was some suggestion that we heard that possibly all that could be done by the end of the year was a relatively quick and dirty 0-0 on goods. And we wouldn't be able to get financial services or professional services where we would probably have a bit more interest than the EU perhaps in. Would you rule out it just being a quick and dirty deal that would leave behind those sectors to come back to a later date? Or is that a possibility?
No, we want to have a free trade agreement, and we also want to make sure that, for example, on things like the mutual recognition of professional qualifications and other areas, that we can cover all those areas of the economy that matter. And one of the things that we are doing is saying that there are existing, as I mentioned earlier, existing precedents for granting equivalence and existing deals that the EU has done with other nations, and as I indicated, we want to take those off-the-shelf arrangements, put them all together, and given that the EU has accepted all of these and that they cover the economic waterfront in different ways, that should be relatively straightforward.
Okay, I get what we want. Are you categorically ruling out, if the EU said, oh, it's too hard, it's taking too long, all we can do is a quick and dirty 0-0 on goods and we'll come back to the rest in future, that would be utterly unacceptable to the government? You'd say no deal in that basis?
No, but I think that, for example, the question of equivalence on financial services is something that the EU's own internal processes should take care of, and we should have reassurance on that during the course of the year. But we want to make sure that we get the best deal possible. But of course, whether or not we get that free trade agreement or not will determine whether or not we end up, as the Prime Minister has pointed out, in a Canada-style or Australia-style relationship.
As a final one, Article 184 requires both parties to act in good faith. Given we've had, 6 weeks or so of this being in force, do you think either party's breached that yet? Have you suggested to the EU perhaps some of their negotiating mandate was a breach of good faith, or have they perhaps raised any issues with that with you yet?
I don't think there's been a breach of good faith, no. I mean, I think that there are some negotiating positions from the EU that I or others might think were, slightly cheeky, but I don't think it's bad faith.
And they haven't suggested that our interpretation of the Northern Ireland Protocol being a little less wide-ranging than theirs?
Oh, no, we're committed to making sure that the Northern Ireland Protocol is implemented in order to underpin the Belfast Good Friday agreement. And the point is well understood that the joint committee is there to ensure that it is implemented and also to resolve some of the questions over precisely how.
Okay. Thank you. Just on that last point, you answered my two original questions about the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol by saying that'll be a matter for the Joint Committee. Could you just confirm for the record that goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland will be required to complete both import declarations and entry summary declarations? Is that the case?
I think I'll wait until after the first meeting of the Joint Committee.
Now, why could you not confirm that's the case?
Because I think it would be wrong for me to prejudice the conversations that we'll have
Well,
in the Joint Committee meeting.
if that is the case, why do those words that I've just put to you appear in the government's own impact assessment of the withdrawal agreement of bill published on the 21st of October 2019? Are you saying the government's interpretation, going back to Mr Mills's point, of what the Northern Ireland Protocol involves has changed, or are you resiling from the words the government itself put out on the 21st of October, which said goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland will be required to complete both import declarations and entry summary declarations? Which is it?
Again, I don't want to prejudice the discussions that we're going to have in the Joint Committee.
Well, if there are any other bits of the impact assessment the government is not willing to confirm now, it'd be jolly helpful for the committee to know. Finally, and we will write to you about a number of issues that I indicated at the beginning. Now, you told businesses to prepare for checks and regulatory customs checks in January, come what may. I know you're not terribly keen on economic forecasts, which you regard with a certain scepticism, but have you done any assessment of what is that going to cost British businesses, which is not economic speculation, it's working out how much does it cost to fill in a customs form and the time and effort involved in doing a regulatory check. Have you made any such assessment? Do you plan to do so?
Well, again, a lot will depend on the nature of the relationship we have, whether or not it will be an Australian or a Canadian-style relationship. But you are right that there are certain steps that government, that business should take, no regret steps. But as I mentioned earlier, some of the steps that business might take are also opportunities. So a business that currently trades only with the EU acquires the means through preparation for being outside the customs union to continue to trade with the EU. That investment is also one which could lead to new trading opportunities elsewhere. So if a company invests in increased capacity, if a company makes a capital investment, is that a cost, or is that a shrewd repositioning for future economic benefits? You know, that is part of the question.
But you're not planning to undertake an assessment of the cost?
We are planning to help business to make that adjustment.
For themselves, but the government's not going to do that. Okay. I think we've just stuck within your hour, and we look forward to you returning. And I'm sure we will ask Mr Frost to appear, and we're grateful for what you said. Thank you for coming. Order, order.
Thank you very much.
Portcullis House, the Boothroyd Room. Portcullis House, the Boothroyd Room. Portcullis House.